Hello everyone. Today I am very excited to share with you this interview I did with Professor Jeff Sugarman. Professor Sugarman works at the Faculty of Education at Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. He has contributed greatly to the field of theoretical and philosophical psychology. His main areas of scholarship include the psychology of personhood, basically what it means to be a person, psychology of selfhood, and human agency. Among his work, I am only going to mention 5 books that he has co-written or co-edited with his colleagues. The first was published in 1999, titled The Psychology of Human Possibility and Constraint. Then in 2003, he published Psychology and the Question of Agency. Then in 2010, Persons, Understanding Psychological Selfhood and Agency. And then 2 co-edited volumes, one, the Wiley Handbook of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology, and more recently, this year, a volume was published titled A Humanities Approach to the Psychology of Personhood. In this interview, we talk about his own journey in psychology and his own formation as an academic scholar, other people or books that have influenced him, as well as a lot of good suggestions and resources for scholars who are interested in similar approaches to psychology. I hope you enjoyed this interview, and if you have any comments or suggestions, please feel free to leave them below. Hello, everybody. Today I'm speaking with Professor Jeff Sugarman. To begin with, perhaps you could share with us your journey in psychology, and if it is applicable, maybe you could divide it between the part where you were trained in mainstream academic psychology to where you had a more philosophical turn.
Sure. I think I'm actually going to start a little bit earlier in my life than university. So I grew up in a family in which the menu for family dinners included conversations about current events, about politics, about science, about religion, about philosophy. And particularly on Sunday evenings when my extended family would gather and the table was cleared, there were often very lively, passionate debates that would erupt, and people would express and defend their opinions vigorously and often very loudly. But as heated as the conversations got, it was always about ideas and never about personalities. And ideas could be dissected and even bludgeoned without ever reflecting on those who were speaking or articulating the ideas or those who were disputing them. People in my family wanted to talk about important things, about life, about the things that were of value to them. But there was never any doubt that the foundation for the discussions was always love and trust and respect. And ethically, people believed, I think, that the greatest respect that you could show someone was to put their opinions and ideas to the highest critical scrutiny that you could muster. And this is kind of the model of civic, democratic, liberal, hermeneutic discourse that I've carried with me through life. And also an enduring interest in questions of human life. What gives life meaning and significance? What is it to be a person? How do we decide whether others merit our contempt or our respect? And those questions have stayed with me, and I think were largely the impetus for my entering psychology. Psychology in the 1970s was very adventurous. It was still very much the last unexplored frontier. And I started university in 1974, and I was in sciences. I was a science major. And my professors were very competent, if not particularly inspiring, but I had the opportunity to take an elective, and I decided to take psychology. And I very distinctly remember my very first psychology class. I was sitting among 300 other undergraduate students in a large lecture theater. We were all excited and a bit apprehensive and nervous about it all. And the professor at the University of Waterloo, who taught the course, was the chair of the department, and Waterloo had one of the largest psychology faculties in North America at the time. And Professor Dial, I remember very distinctly walking into the room and setting his briefcase down beside the podium and surveying the class. And he asked, "Are there any questions?" And we all looked at each other in disbelief. Like, how could we have any questions? This was the very first class that we were taking. Many of us, the very first class we'd had in university. And there was a silence that befell the entire room. And he picked up his briefcase and walked out of the door. And he had, you know, the second class, and his classes were tremendously engaging. And the second class I took was a class in altered states of consciousness. You know, where in departments of psychology do you still have classes in altered states? It was fascinating, absolutely wonderful. And I was hooked into psychology. Unfortunately, I was soon deflected into the mainstream of psychological theorizing and research, and my interests in human significance were replaced and supplanted by questions of experimental design and achieving statistical significance. And after that, after completing my undergraduate degree, I decided to take some time off and pursue music. And I became a professional musician for the next decade and went back to graduate school in my mid-30s. I was accepted into the Masters of Counseling program at Fraser University. And the classes were interesting. There were wonderful things going on in the late 1980s in counseling psychology, systems theory, stuff coming out of the Palo Alto Institute, narrative psychology. It was all very interesting and kind of kept me engaged. But I graduated in 1990, and I was making more money than I ever did as a musician, so I decided to stay on and do a doctorate. And there were really three events during my doctoral studies, when I look back on it, that inspired me to pursue theoretical and philosophical psychology. The first was that I decided to do a doctorate in educational psychology, which placed me in a faculty of education. Mm-hmm. And all of the education doctoral students were required to take two courses together. Now, as it turned out, I was the only person studying education psychology in these courses. There were people who were studying philosophy of education and sociology of education and the history of education, curriculum theory and language arts and educational technology and environmental education. And these were really interesting courses. The discussions were wonderful. But every once in a while, a matter of psychological interest would come up and everybody would turn to me, being the psychologist in the crowd. Everybody expected me to have answers, and people would say to me things like, "So you have an instrument or a measure for self-esteem, and if I score 10 on this thing and you get 9, that means I've got more of this stuff than you do, and what does that actually mean, and what else can you do that with? Can you measure justice or empathy or love?" And these were questions for which I was completely under-equipped or unequipped to answer, having been schooled in the canons of psychological critique, which are extremely insular and narrow. Psychologists never ask about these questions. We ask about internal validity and external validity and experimental bias and things like that. And my shortcomings in my education had become strikingly apparent. So this was the first thing that happened. Mm. Second event, and that was something of a response to the situation, was that I made a good friend in the class who was a philosopher of education and a very smart guy, who put me on a diet of hermeneutics and other philosophical texts that he was reading. And we would meet for 2 or 3 hours, 3 or 4 days a week, to talk about texts. And this is a kind of experience that I would wish for every doctoral student. It was fantastic. It was really incredible, a very special time in my life when I look back on it. And gradually I got interested in philosophy, in conceptual matters, in historical matters, particularly as they pertain to psychology. And I started to feel like I was returning to the questions that had motivated my interest in psychology in the first place. About personhood, about selfhood, about meaning in life, and so forth. And one of the texts that he introduced me to was Charles Taylor's Sources of the Self, which was published in 1989, and really is not only a remarkable book, but a landmark in hermeneutic thought. And it introduced me to the idea of philosophical anthropology, of going back in history and locating the ideas that had animated people's beliefs about themselves, what it was to be a person, and how these beliefs and the terms that they provided really incarnated people's subjectivity. This was a very unique idea to me and something that was much outside the psychological mainstream. And the third and probably most consequential of these three events is the fact that I was very fortunate at the time I entered doctoral studies in 1990 that Jack Martin, who had originally been at Simon Fraser and had taken a 15-year sojourn at the University of Western Ontario in London, had come back to Simon Fraser. And I ended up with really the consummate mentor whose interests in philosophy and history of psychology were blooming at the time. And I really can't overemphasize the impact that his thinking has had on my thought, and has been ongoing in collaborations between the two of us over the past 30 years, which went by in a blink. But to mention one text that Jack introduced me to that, in addition to Sources of the Self, formed a cornerstone of my dissertation, was Ram Haray's Personal Being. This book really introduced me to a sociocultural psychology. And I'll mention one other very formative text that I read at the time, which was published in 1990, and that's Kurt Danziger's Constructing the Subject. And that book demonstrated the explanatory power of historical method for psychology. That text and Danziger's subsequent work has had a very marked impact on my thought. I think particularly of his 1997 book, Naming the Mind, How Psychology Found Its Language, which I think should be mandatory reading for all psychology graduate students. It's a powerful book, and really is an antidote to the ahistoricism of psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And really, that's the short story of my initiation into the rest of this office.
Mm-hmm. And there is some thematic continuity in it, starting with the early dinner conversations. And there was a resemblance between those early dinner conversations and the doctoral seminars,
Yes.
in which you also assumed the role of a psychology representative. And
Sure.
yeah, there's a line of thought that regards the emergence of, this looks at how people emerge, persons emerge within the context of conversations and discourse. And that applies to everybody's life. So I wanted to mention in the introduction the recent book that you and Jack Martin edited, the collection of chapters. And the book is called A Humanist Approach to Psychology of Personhood. And it came out very recently. And you have a chapter there. And I noticed that your interest in neoliberalism and neoliberal philosophy and form of life is also expressed there. You also included in that chapter. And that was a question I wanted to ask you about your interest in neoliberalism, what it means for psychology, and maybe you could elaborate a little on that.
Sure. Well, curiously, my interest in neoliberalism began in the classroom and with students. As professors, we have this unique feature of our jobs, and that is that we get older, but our students stay exactly the same age. And it allows us to mark the generations as they come through our classrooms. And it started to become very apparent to me just how different, particularly with the most recent generation, how different these people are from me. And that one of the greatest mistakes that I can make is to walk into a classroom and think that these folks are just like me. They're not at all. And I came across some writing of some folks that were trying to put their fingers on the pulse of contemporary society, and were writing psychologically about the shifts that were going on in subjectivity and personhood at the time. Particularly people writing about socio-political issues, economic issues, and probably most significantly politics, or to use Foucault's term, governmentality, which has to do with the power and control that institutions exert on people. That has not simply to do with how we live our lives, but also the ways in which our subjectivities are formed. Some of the work that I read, Phil Cushman and Peter Guilford wrote a paper in the now defunct journal, the Psychohistory Review. It was published in 1999. I think it was called From Emptiness to Multiplicity, the Self of the Year 2000. And I still assigned this paper in my class. I think it was very much ahead of its time, very prescient. I read The Saturated Self by Ken Gergen. I read a little book by a theorist named Richard Sennett, which was called The Corrosion of Character. And through these and other readings, it became very apparent to me that socio-political and economic conditions have a very profound role in reconstituting people's understanding of themselves. And probably the most powerful socio-political and economic condition with which we're faced in the contemporary world is neoliberalism. I started to investigate neoliberalism. I knew nothing about economics. I was not an economic theorist, and neoliberalism started out as an economic theory. I looked at its major progenitors, its principles, its history, and then started to become interested in psychology's role in perpetrating, I think quite innocently, I believe, the neoliberals' agenda. And my work on the topic has explored the emergence of the neoliberal self and the variety of means by which this has occurred. I think that it's important to understand that neoliberalism isn't just something that's external to us, something that we could add as a variable to a regression equation, that it's moved inside us, so to speak. The social surround of neoliberalism is moving inside personhood. Mm-hmm. And so you're seeing things like the entrepreneurial attitudes that people now have, the valuing of adaptability and flexibility and mobility in the labor market, the propensity for risk-taking, the unceasing need for self-promotion, and the valuing of visibility and recognition over virtues that were very prominent not long ago, things like authenticity and humility, the difficulty in making commitments to things, for fear of missing out on that much more fruitful opportunity that's just around the corner, this fear of missing out thing. The epidemic of impatience that we see around us, the acceleration of ordinary life, an orientation to fulfillment, as cramming as many experiences as possible into your life and recording them and posting them on social media as a kind of immortality project, to use Ernest Becker's phrase. The notion of identity as something that's fluid and multiple and malleable, as opposed to something that's singular, unified, and deep. The fragmentation of identity, the fragmentation of thought and of experience. And I think that many of these kinds of things could be, I hate to use the word symptoms, but let's use it, characteristics, can be traced to neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. Put it tersely to people that don't know about neoliberalism, it's really the belief that the social good is best advanced by extending the scope and frequency of market transactions to the point of bringing market rationality to every corner of human endeavor. But it's not just that neoliberalism creates conditions to which people are supposed to adapt. The function of the market in neoliberalism is not to cater to the wants and needs of individuals, but rather to produce individuals that function in ways that the market requires. And I think Simon Clark puts it beautifully. He says something to the effect that the point of neoliberalism isn't to make a model that's adequate to the real world. It's to make the real world more adequate to the model. And in this model, human freedom equates with market freedom. So that neoliberalism is really a solution to the problem of governmentality, to use Foucault's term again. The problem for governmentality in advanced liberal democracies is, how do you govern people for whom freedom is a paramount good? Well, the way you do it is you channel their freedom through the processes and mechanisms of the market, and you harness the idea of freedom and make it a matter of individual choice. So that in liberalism, governing occurs by giving people choices and making them responsible for the choices they make. The problem is that now, of course, the kinds of choices that we're faced with are the result of reduced government services that transfers risk from the state onto individuals. And this is an economic neoliberal strategy. So in the climate of neoliberal economics, there's less and less that separates risk-taking profiteers and entrepreneurs from the rest of us, for whom risk is being woven into the fabric of everyday life, whether it's matters of our health, whether it's matters of the care and education of our children, whether it's the unpredictability of employment, whether it's dignity in old age. It's that the choice, the idea of choice is intimately connected to freedom. And anything that enhances our individual choice is believed to be good, because choice, the idea of choice, is intimately connected to our ideas and understanding of freedom. But once you start to see the ways in which choice is both manifested and constrained within neoliberal structures, you start to see just how pervasive neoliberalism has become in society. And I'll give you an example, actually, that I thank Thomas Teal for pointing out to me. We have an endless variety of credit cards that we can acquire. Unbelievable range of different kinds of credit cards and the services they offer. Try to do something without a credit card. Try to buy something online. Try to make an airline reservation. Try to make a hotel reservation. Try to rent a car. I mean, the point is that much of our choice is precluded by institutional structures that channel these choices in very specific ways. So that's kind of just a thumbnail sketch of some of the aspects of neoliberalism, and particularly its influence in reconstituting our subjectivities in various kinds of ways.
This is an experience I've had several times in the past few months. Students, and I also have a local book club here that we meet. Some people talk about how they are distractible. They're very distracted, and they pay attention to their phone a lot, more than they should, and they cannot slow down to just read a book. And they feel that impatience, and the way we talk about that experience is we think it is a lack of discipline, not realizing that this is actually a way of having been disciplined in this paradigm of neoliberal economy. That state of being distractible, not being able to slow down and read, that is its own form of having been being disciplined. That is an outcome. It is not. And when we work towards another form of discipline, we have to move and break away the factors that keep us in this initial kind of discipline. And you also mentioned briefly psychology's role in not recognizing and unknowingly perpetuating this neoliberal system. I would also agree with that, with the exception of some works like yourself, your own work, which raises awareness. And it is not, I think it is important to emphasize, in addition to what you already said, that these are not different ways of talking about the human person. It is more radical than that. These are ways of constructing the human person. There are different ways in which the human beings can ontologically exist. And being aware of that difference is very important, I think. All right. So, did you have something to add to that before my next question?
Well, I think I agree with you. I think that the acceleration of life is a very fascinating thing. Acceleration is built into the core of capitalism. Mm-hmm. I think that life is speeding up because capitalism has uncontrolled acceleration built into its core, and things will continue to speed up as long as we are in a capitalistic system. But there's a long story to this. Actually, I have a paper coming out with Aaron Thrift on precisely this issue. If you would have asked people in the 1970s, what's your biggest problem? People would say, my life lacks meaning. And we trotted out to, happiness camps and went to see gurus and psychotherapists and tried mind-altering drugs and all, just try and find meaning in our life. And I think if you ask people now, what's your biggest problem in life? A lot of people will say, I don't have enough time. And I became kind of interested in what caused that shift. And this paper is kind of an attempt at an explanation for how that happened.
Great, great. What would you consider as your key, the highlights in your contribution so far in terms of both books and articles?
Well, I think in addition to the writings on neoliberalism, and there are several, three books that I published with Jack Martin over the course of about a decade, I think are pretty big landmarks in my academic career. And I think particularly the second of those, what we refer to as our trilogy, which was published in 2003. It's called The Psychology of the Question of Agency. It's perhaps the best and most significant of those three books. And in that book, we deal fundamentally with two problems. The first is that in psychology, there's a fundamental incoherence. Psychological science operates as a deterministic science, determinism being the philosophy that every event has a cause. And so the idea is, or the implication is, that if you can specify the antecedent causes of a behavior or a thought or an experience, then you can control it and predict it. So that's psychological science, which operates in this deterministic fashion. But if you go to see a psychologist or a clinician or a therapist, they presume you have free will, that you can decide for yourself how you want to act, that your thoughts and actions and experience are not determined in that way. Otherwise, therapy loses its meaning. And the same is true for education. So there's this fundamental incoherence between determinism and free will in psychology. And in response, Jack and I formulated, I think, an original argument for human agency. It's an argument by elimination. I won't rehearse the whole thing, but it tries to explain how reductive strategies that have become quite popular in psychology, whether it's reduction in neurophysiology or sociocultural factors or to evolution or to computational scripts, if human agency can't be reduced to any of those things solely or in combination, then what you're left with is a self-determining kind of agency that is a sui generis, distinctive thing and has ontological status in and of itself. And this is important, and this is the second problem. Because if psychology doesn't have a distinctive subject matter, if you can reduce psychology to one of these other things, then we don't have a discipline of psychology, and we might as well all become neuroscientists or cultural theorists or computational theorists or evolution, whatever it is, and just shut the doors on the discipline. So part of what that book attempts to do is to give a defense of what the proper subject matter of psychology is, and we believe that it's personhood. That's basically that book. My program of work has extended historical ontology as an approach to psychological inquiry has been very important to me. I don't know if anybody else cares about it, but it's been pretty central to my work. And once you start to understand that psychological objects, these are the objects that psychologists study, whether it's memory or motivation or self-regulation or attitudes or various psychopathologies and so forth, you can treat them as or understand them as a kind of object in a way. And once you understand that these objects are historically constituted and that they have their own particular distinct historical trajectory, I think that you have to treat them like archaeological sites, where you have to dig down through layers of meaning and use and uncover the constellations of conditions that made for their emergence in the first place, or for that matter, their disappearance. And what becomes strikingly apparent when you do this kind of work is the contingency and particularity of psychological objects, and that psychologists have been mistakenly fixing psychological features to an assumed essential human nature rather than to the institutions within which we become persons. Social, cultural, moral, ethical, political, economic, educational, and even religious aspects of the context is what the stuff of our psychology is made, right? Two other books that I think are landmarks in my career are edited volumes. The first is the Wiley Handbook of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology that I edited with Jack Martin and Kate Slaney. And this project comprises 28 chapters contributed by 37 different authors. It was a Herculean task. And the impetus for this project was that when you have students that come to you and they ask you, how do you do theoretical and philosophical psychology? All we could do was point to exemplars. And very rare did you ever come across anything that said, this is how you do theoretical and philosophical psychology. So the book was an attempt to ameliorate this deficiency. And we approached folks that had well-developed programs of inquiry in theoretical and philosophical psychology that had some sort of particular approach that had been developed over time. And we went to them and asked them to write about how it is that they do what they do. And remarkably, people really put their best foot forward, and there's some wonderful chapters in that book. It's a project of which I'm very proud to have been involved. As you mentioned, my most recent book is also co-edited with Jack, A Humanities Approach to the Psychology of Personhood. And the premise of the book is that psychology needs to be about persons and their lives. That's the proper subject matter of psychology. And the book is a selection of essays written by authors who show how the various humanities disciplines inspire their approaches to psychology. And there are authors that talk about their use of philosophy, their use of history and historiography, psychobiography, literary studies, work in the studies in the visual arts, Marxist theory and methodology. And the book is really part of a recent movement to help legitimize these forms of work in psychology that are as legitimate as psychological science. And I think it's interesting to juxtapose psychological humanities with psychological science, particularly as a way of countering the efforts of very powerful psychological institutions in the world to stamp psychology as exclusively a STEM discipline. So I would say that, there's 50 or 60 articles in both chapters and 7, but I mean, those I think are the landmark pieces of work that I think have most marked my career.
Or at least places to begin reading your work, and then maybe people will become interested in one aspect, they can dig deeper. Yeah, it took me a while to realize the significance of this, the move that is common. I wouldn't say maybe the essential, but I would say at least it is common in scientific psychology, natural scientific psychology, which is the goal of removing the person and replacing the person with non-person entities like variables or cognitive functions or neural functions or models. And always the characteristic that they have, those replacements who are placed instead of persons, is that they are causal, that they're subject to causal explanations. And that's a kind of forgetfulness, in my opinion, of the task of psychology, which is the study of persons. I also wanted to ask you about two kinds of challenges for theoretical and philosophically minded psychologists. One of them is the marginality challenge. The other one is the pedagogical challenge. Because we've talked about this previously, I would say briefly that the marginality challenge is basically being relatively in an unpopular position. So personally for me, when I sometimes teach something in my classes, students would tell me that, oh, but this is not what we learned in these other courses. We learned that statistical models are great; they are the best we can hope for, or that computational model is the maximum, is the top, is the ultimate goal of psychology. So that's being an unpopular voice. The other challenge, so maybe you can respond to this before I talk about the pedagogical challenge.
Sure. Davood, I think like you, this kept me awake at night for a while. It does go away. But it's a thorny issue. We place students in a difficult position. They're caught between adhering to the psychological mainstream and ensuring their prospects for a future career in psychology. They're caught between that and our enlightened crusade. I'll tell you that I don't pull my punches anymore. One of the great privileges of age is I care less and less whose feathers I ruffle. I spent the better part of a lifetime reading and thinking and writing critiques about the mainstream. And I teach and defend those critiques because I find them compelling. And so, for example, I'll give you some examples of things that I do to make them compelling. So I talk about pseudo-measurement in psychology. I'll start a class with a very controversial claim. I'll say that psychologists rarely, if ever, measure anything. And because, well, at least in any scientifically legitimate application of the term measurement, scientific measurement relies on standard units or metrics that stand independent of the things being measured. And this is true of everyday life, whether you're talking about carpentry or cooking or calculating the weather. Not only are the metrics of size, of speed, of distance, and temperature, and so forth, independent of the things that are being measured, but so too are the devices by which the measurements are being indicated. And psychologists have no such standard metrics or units or devices for the measurement of psychological phenomena. Psychologists count things, but counting isn't measuring. So you might be able to count the frequencies of ideas, but you can't measure ideas like you can measure length in centimeters or electrical current in amperes, right? And part of the problem is that human thoughts, actions, and experiences are contextually constituted. They don't come in discrete units. And someone might say, well, what about MRI studies? What about blood flow in the brain? And I'll say, well, okay. But then you're going to have to show me a very clear relationship between neurophysiological states and specific psychological states, and good luck with that. Mm-hmm. To go back to your earlier point, your brain might have a temperature module, it might have a light and darkness module, it might have a viscosity module, but if there's not a person who acts in the world, you would never have a hot black cup of coffee, right? There has to be a person at the center of this stuff. And then there's psychologism, which I've written about, which is a term that I use to designate a particular style of reasoning in psychology. And here's how I introduce the idea. I tell students I'm going to tell them how to become rich and famous in psychology. So already I've got their attention. Right? And the way you do this is, first of all, you observe persons' everyday activities in the world. And then you identify and isolate what looks to be a common feature of their action or their experience. And then you assume that the source of this feature is some sort of discrete interior psychological structure or process. Then you give it a name. Then you assign it causal force so that you say that this thing inside there is what's causing the action or the experience. So the person's apparent monitoring of themselves, that's caused by their self-regulation. The person's opinion of themselves is caused by their self-esteem. The degree of confidence with which they approach tasks, that's caused by their self-efficacy. Their conception of themselves, that's caused by their self-concept. Their reluctance to attempt tasks is caused by their fear of failure. And you conveniently forget that something can't be the cause of itself. Okay? Then, once you've dissected and conceptualized it in this way, you devise an instrument that is proposed to be able to target and measure the presumed or hypothesized interior psychological entity. And most commonly, those psychological instruments ask people to introspect or self-report on their actions or their experiences. And this is believed, of course, to reflect this internal psychological property. And this is true whether you're talking about Wechsler intelligence tests or the self-esteem inventory or the Beck depression inventory or the Rorschach test. And it's also true of brain imaging techniques, which also rely on introspection to establish some sort of relationship between the hypothesized interior psychological entity and measures of blood flow in the brain. What's fascinating is then these kinds of data are assumed to be evidence of this interior psychological phenomena. But the fact is that that data is not proof of the phenomena's existence. And the fundamental question of whether or not these things actually exist is never addressed. But don't worry about that. Write it up and publish it, right? And then to make the point crystal clear, I'll talk about the Dr. Scholl's measure of self-toedness, right? Which is a measure of the degree to which people esteem their toes. And there's items like, my toes are important to me. I like to show my toes to others. I could not part with my toes. And then, you can say that the measure has tremendous inter-item correlations. It's highly reliable. There's wonderful concurrent validity in that it correlates highly with measures of self-eyeballness, self-earness, self-noseness. My tongue's firmly planted in my cheek. But you can see all kinds of psychological measures and concepts that are equally ridiculous. I mean, not long ago, I came across an article that was claiming that there is an interior psychological characteristic, part of our personality, that pertains to people's need to create drama in their lives and in the lives of others. I mean, it's that ridiculous, right? And then I'll talk about Smethson's work, with whom you're quite familiar, right? Who more than 40 years ago pointed out that many of the claims that psychologists make are not actually empirical claims, that they're analytic claims masquerading as empirical claims. And this makes the research on which they're based completely unnecessary, redundant, and delusive. And there's all kinds of wonderful, well-known psychological claims that are examples of this. From well-cited studies, things like individuals are likely to be surprised when they encounter the unexpected, or those predisposed to risk-taking are more likely to practice unsafe sex, or we tend to repeat the activities for which we find pleasurable. I mean, there's a classic. Or, I love the Piagetian one of children who have yet to develop a conception of one-to-one correspondence cannot detect whether different placements of the same number of objects are equivalent. I mean, why would you expect that? And what's fascinating is that if the hypotheses were not confirmed by the studies, we wouldn't throw the hypotheses out, right? Because they're common sense. We think that there's a problem with the methodology, or there's a problem with the experimental conditions. It's like doing a study to find out that all bachelors are unmarried men. This is a claim that is true by analysis and definition, not by empirical research. And many claims in psychology are of this sort. Now, you can go through these kinds of examples, which I think are pretty compelling, and I can make them even more compelling and talk about more of them. But what you would expect is that once the genie is out of the bottle, it's pretty hard to stuff her back in. So, once you understand things in this way, it should be very difficult to go back to business as usual. But the sad truth is, Davood, at least in my experience, is that most students do. They go back to the mainstream. Now, those who don't, need to be encouraged, but told very frankly what awaits them and how to negotiate a future as a theoretical and philosophical psychologist. And in my experience, the best land on their feet. The bright folks, they do okay. And, I will also say that as I've aged, my aspirations have been tempered. I no longer believe that I'm going to change the world, and I am more modest about what I can accomplish.
Thank you for that patient response. Very detailed, and I'm sure very helpful to people who would listen to those ways into beginning to criticize. But even in your parody, there was the advantage of mainstream psychology became apparent, with namely that you can have a clear method prior to even having interests in any topic. And I think that is one of the main advantages of mainstream psychology and why people would go back, because it's really nice to have that pre-existing method that you could go engage with, a student would engage in with, and the method will begin to generate and then form the consciousness of the researcher. But I would say the non-mainstream, the critical approach, would have to be more creative with their methods. So every critical psychologist, in a sense, every philosophical psychologist would have their own method that is suited, that is created for the sake of their subject matter, to some degree at least. Which brings us to the pedagogical dimension, the pedagogical challenge of theoretical psychology. It is relatively difficult to teach it to students. And as you already said, that the best would survive, the best would cope with the challenges. But would you construct intermediate steps of giving maybe a method of doing literary analysis on some text or some philosophical or historical, some constructed method that would act as an in-between step before they can engage with the full-fledged theoretical philosophical methods?
Well, there's a big push for qualitative inquiry. Mm-hmm. Psychology, and I want to say something about this. I've read some very enlightening qualitative research, but I would have to say that it's not par for the course, and that I find much qualitative inquiry a tedious recapitulation of the obvious, right? Derivation of the obvious from the obvious. I think that many qualitative researchers are just as scientific and methodolatrous as their quantitative counterparts. Methodology being the worship of method. Empiricism is not always useful. And methodological fidelity, being true to the method, is no guarantee that you're going to produce anything valid, let alone interesting. Mm. So, I think that philosophical, conceptual, historical, critical scholarship in psychology is what I promote, but it's very challenging. It's very demanding. And the plain truth is that not all graduate students are capable of doing it, right? It requires a particular disposition. Now, I think also what you have to know to be able to do it competently far exceeds conducting empirical research, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, and as you rightly point out, where the prescribed methodology is much clearer and easier to follow. It's a very much a it's litigious society. If as long as we follow the rules and follow the law, we're gonna be okay. Mm-hmm. And I've often said to my colleagues in the psychology department, I sit on a fair number of committees. I said, why do you get these wonderfully creative, highly intelligent people, and then ask them to check their intelligence and creativity at the door as they enter the psychology department? The fact is, with empirical research, you just don't have to know as much. And I'm increasingly disappointed when I am an examiner on a qualitative research thesis or dissertation that claims to be phenomenological, and the person doesn't know who Husserl is or has never read any Husserl. How is this legitimate? Mm-hmm. So I am very careful about encouraging students to do the things of which they're capable. Now, that said, there are all kinds of projects with differing degrees of difficulty and commitment. And it's really important to help students circumscribe their theses and dissertations in a way that they can succeed while sustaining their motivation and their interest and learning important things at the same time. Mm-hmm. Well, that I think is it in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would say one of the characteristics of people who might be suited for this line of work is, I wouldn't say it is things like intelligence or being smart, but instead I would say a big part of it is being genuinely bothered by a problem, being genuinely having a question, having a problem to think about, to want to pursue, which then safeguards the person against discouragements or challenges. That
right.
might be, yeah.
I think you have to be bothered by things. I think you have to have a lot of discipline. Pick up being in time. Just think of how long it takes to go through a text like that. How many sources you need. The fact that you need a teacher or a mentor or a peer to go through. I mean, it really takes a lot of reading and study to do these things.
Right.
Much more so than if you want to write about hermeneutics, just think about what you have to know to be able to write competently about it.
Absolutely. Yes, so picking up these beginning challenges or initial challenges like reading, being in time, highlights or reveals, unconceals so many other things like the importance of a mentor who would read the text with us and other things. Yeah, that would be a great way to start. Now, again, it might be difficult to talk about this, but what would be your advice or your suggestions to beginning researchers or beginning teachers, a new faculty who has these aspirations, who is critical and wants to do something with it?
I think there's a lot of good sources out there. I mentioned the Wiley Handbook of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology. I think it's a terrific resource. As I mentioned, I think Danziger's Naming the Mind should be mandatory reading for all psychology graduate students, although I think it might be a bit difficult for undergraduate students. There's, I mentioned Phil Cushman and Peter Guilford's 1999 article in Psychohistory Review. I often assign that to undergraduate students with paired with an earlier piece by Phil Cushman that he published in American Psychologist in 1990 called Why the Self is Empty. Mm. What's fascinating about these two pieces is that the 1990 piece describes subjectivity as it emerged after the Second World War. And the latter piece, the 1999 piece, the more recent piece rather, describes the contemporary neoliberal multiple self. And when students, undergraduate students read this, it really concretizes their experience. Not only do they see themselves in the 1999 piece, but they can see their parents and their grandparents in the 1990 piece. So it really resonates for them and it really engages them, and they start to become interested in these descriptions of who and what they are and their parents and grandparents are. So I very much like that work. I think Sunil Bhatia's work on identity is very accessible and fascinating, particularly with the great interest in identity these days. There's a lot on identity and critical race theory being written, some tremendously wonderful work. In a more traditional vein, there's Critical Thinking in Psychology, which is an edited volume by Brent Slife and Jeff Reber and Frank Richardson, which has it was written to be accessible to students and raises fundamental issues in theoretical and philosophical psychology. There's Thomas Teo's volume you're familiar with, Re-envisioning Theoretical Psychology. Thomas also has a book co-authored with Richard Walsh and Angelina Videla. It's a kind of a text called Critical History and Philosophy of Psychology. And if you look at it, there's two of the, I think, very terrific journals in theoretical and philosophical psychology are the Journal of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology, which is the flagship journal of Division 24 of the American Psychological Association, and Theory and Psychology, which is the journal associated with the International Society for Theory and Psychology. These are excellent journals, that have all kinds of pieces that are written with varying degrees of accessibility. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I would say start there, those kinds of sources.
Great. So I think your comments already covered a lot of the responses to the teaching question, how to approach teaching and recognizing the challenges of teaching differently. For me, I had in the past couple of years, in the beginning, I had a relatively easy time, but then I started to have this reputation of being overly philosophical, which has, as a previous generation of students informs the next generation, that produces some bias against what they experience in class. So I might have to put extra effort to act against the reputation issue that builds up.
I wouldn't work against that reputation. I think it's a good one to have, and I think you have to be true to yourself. The fact is that the aim of a liberal education is to produce citizens who can use their minds and think for themselves, right? And liberal education really originates as an Enlightenment project. And one of the major spokespersons for the Enlightenment was Kant. Mm. And Kant was asked once to write an article on what it's like to live in the era in which he lived, the Enlightenment. And he said that the model of the Enlightenment was that people started using their own minds and to use their own reason, to trust their own reason and stop blindly obeying authority and accepting authority as the truth, and to start thinking for yourself. Mm-hmm. And I think that education, particularly in the liberal tradition, when it's at its best, is emancipatory. And I think it's emancipatory in psychology when we raise students' awareness about the very real socio-political, economic, social, moral, cultural, ethical, ontological issues that are shaping them into the kinds of people that they are, right? And particularly as these have varied over history, because eras leave their marks on us. We bear the marks of particular eras. Now, to try and know this reality and to present it is really the challenge that I think education compels. And it's really not easy coming to know it or teaching it. There's enormous hurdles. You know, it's really difficult to get students to think for themselves and to help them to discover something of who and what they are, what society is, to comprehend the stuff of which their psychology is comprised, you know, how it's come to be this way, to imagine alternatives, whether and what can be done psychologically to change and better the world and enhance people's existence, and to raise their consciousnesses and to have yours raised by them, so to speak. So, you know, I think when I'm asked about teaching, you know, Jeff, what's your philosophy of teaching? I usually say something trite like, oh, I try to get students to think outside the box, you know, meaningless cliche. But then I'll say something like, well, you know, to teach outside the box or to think outside the box, you first of all have to realize that you're in a box. And I try to show the ways in which the socio-political context in which we live creates a box that constrains their thinking and the kinds of beings that they are. And once they start to see the contours of the box and the contingency of these contours, that opens up some room for seeing how things could be otherwise. It opens up a space of possibility and this was really, you know, the Foucaultian advance on Kant. Kant was interested in discerning what are the necessary limits of human thought and experience. And Foucault was looking at what of those limits are actually dispensable and that can be amended and modified. And by doing this kind of Foucaultian critique of the present, you start to be able to think about how we might be otherwise if our socio-political institutions were otherwise. And, you know, I think this is a very critical insight with respect to the present moment in history, in light of current discussions about systemic racism. These kinds of issues can only be approached philosophically. You're not going to get at them through empirical research. You know, it has to do with knowing what something is before you can go out and look for a case of it, right? And the fact is that most of the theoretical and philosophical professors I know that would get the kind of criticism that you would receive or that you might be fearful of are quite widely respected in their departments, even if people don't understand what they do. Mm-hmm. They're often left alone to do what they do because there is a kind of respect for that knowledge that comes of what's required to become a theoretical and philosophical psychologist and to become philosophically astute about the nature of the subject matter, to be able to talk about meaning and value and fulfillment and all of the things that people entered psychology in the first place to understand before the big bait and switch happens, right? Before those ideas and questions get translated into alpha levels and null hypothesis testing.
Exactly. This is the second major difference in my mind between mainstream and critical theoretical psychology. We already talked about the removal of the person as one tendency in mainstream psychology. The other tendency that goes along with that is the isolation and abstraction of the given question from the context, from everything else that is going around it. So I could be in an experimental lab, and I could work on a project on perception or decision making, and disregard everything else politically, institutionally, economically that is going on around me. But a genuine psychological project of personhood would see its connection and will explore its connection to everything else that is intrinsically involved in being a person, being in relationships, being a participant in institutions, political systems, economical systems, with their unfairness and injustice built in. Yeah, so that's also part of the excitingness of this path in psychology, but also what makes it challenging. Okay, good, great. Professor Sugarman, thank you so much for being here for this interview and for your very inspiring work. I would also end by saying that your writing is really good. It's very friendly to the beginning readers, easy to understand, at the same time very enlightening and engaging. So I'm grateful to have found you and your work. And thank you for this interview.
Thank you very much, Davood. I very much appreciated the opportunity to do the interview. And I think what you're doing is highly meritorious, and I thank you for taking the initiative to do it. I think it's a very good project.
Thank you very much.